We'd like to welcome you to our presentation on our team's work on winning the Carmack Prize. And we'd like to do it, one of the purposes of what we did, and we'll talk about, is to talk about what we succeeded at and what we failed at, and we'd like to do better. Part of the purpose is to document this in a public way so that we can all collectively as a community learn why what worked and what didn't work. And hopefully in this presentation, we will go through, hopefully in a proud but yet humble way, what we succeeded in doing and what we'd like to do better next time. The team presentation today will be, I'll start out with kind of the overview of what our goals were, what our design mission, and then my teammate, Casey Barker, will come on to go through the details of what actually happened, the as-built, if you like, what the results of the flights were, the data that happened, and hopefully we're also going to give you a little treat of some video. Combination of both what it looks like at 104,000 feet, and also a little bit about I think a little bit about the celebration of the joy of rocket flight. All of us are here to do this because we get excited about it. We like to communicate that excitement is about the way of learning about the world. And so we have a little video that hopefully will communicate that celebration. The team was myself, Casey, Eric Ebert, Becky Green, Jim Green, Dave Raimondi, Tom Rouse, and Steve Wigfield. The entire team is composed of level 3 flyers. I did a little computation, and I discovered that the team collectively, perhaps over our careers over the last 20 years, since we've been all flying for a long time, have probably put up roughly about 1 million Newton seconds of rockets. So we think we know a little bit about it, and are desiring to learn a lot more. So the project goals. First was to rocket flight to near space at 100,000 plus AGL. Now, this is a goal that many of us had for a long time before John Carmack invented his prize. So John, coincidentally, came up with a prize to actually reward people for doing this. And his criteria for doing it was 100,000 plus AGL, a full and complete recovery within 24 hours. You had GPS documentation of the entire flight. And then you publicize a report on the internet about what you did, how you did it, what went right, what went wrong. It turns out that is exactly aligned with our desires about having rocketry be something not we should be ashamed about. We should be able to do this because we know how to do it and we can do it well and we can get better at it. Second was open design and documentation. It's an open design, it's open source, it's a new world. So there's nothing proprietary here. There is knowledge we have, we'd like to share it. The third was an airframe design philosophy. As we'll talk about in a bit, most of the folks that have gone and tried to either succeeded or not succeeded at trying to go to 100K have had really big rockets. And we don't think that was necessary. So we looked at the issue of how well what was the smallest rocket we could build that would meet the mission in a reasonable and safe way. So we looked at issues of drag and efficiency, minimum propellant. We wanted to use commercial motors because the idea of open source, we want it to be easy for anybody else to do. Okay. We made it for a composite construction, so you don't have to learn how to be a welder to do it. Anybody can do it. If someone, our listening, you can build it in your basement out of commercial parts that you can procure. We wanted a reusable flight profile. And maybe this is our hubris showing, but we felt we wanted to be able to not only recover it, but fly it again. And actually have a flight profile that was safe enough to recover and fly again so that in fact it was not some ballistic missile. So the idea of usable recovery and to keep it within waiver. We'll talk a little bit about what we did to look for that. And actually we had a subsidiary goal of thinking about having 3 different teams build identical airframes and fly 3 identical ones to demonstrate that in fact it wasn't any particular team, but 3 different teams. As it happened, 2 out of the 3 teams didn't really come forward to build. One of them was a university team, and we really wanted a university team as part of this as well. So in essence, we ended up building really 2 airframes out of 1 team and flying them as one group. We wanted a usable science payload. You know, most of us guys, in fact, most of you can look at it, are RLS and CANSAT folks. We've been flying this stuff for 14 years. And we believe deeply in the idea of flying science payloads. And so we intentionally designed it to fly a CANSAT-sized payload. We wanted to do a live webcast to be able to show that it's real time to social media, that in fact we can share the experience. And lastly, to document the project in a way that the system and hopefully the results can be replicated, not just replicated, but improved on, so that we all collectively can learn and improve our own rocketry on the basis of what our experience was. So a little bit of background. Almost everybody in the major team comes out of the RLS program. That was the previous presentation. We've now done over the last 14 years, we've done 500 student flights. We've had 1 failure to deliver a payload up to 12,000 feet. Not a bad reliability record. Most of those airframes fly about 15 to 20 times during their useful life. This is an RLS rocket over here, flying on an M1419. And so we have a standard of an RLS flyer of making it reliable, safe, reusable, and the idea of responsibility in flying a student payload. We want that student payload to succeed because the students put a lot of time and effort into it. So the highest goal is delivering the payload successfully and safely. The teams are kind of a mixed set of teams from 2 separate projects. There was a project about 6 years ago called 2100K that tried a similar project and failed. And there was a subsequent project called 99K that tried a similar one with EX motors, but also tried and failed. And out of those 2 experiences, we all learned a lot collectively. We learned a lot out of our failures, and we tried to put a lot of that into this program as well. And lastly, we're looking at a little bit of history. And if we look at most amateur projects have used very large and big rockets, largely with EX motors. And if we look at, for example, GoFast, Kai Michelson's project, to 116 kilometers, he has a ratio between altitude and total impulse of 0.2. The most famous one is the Quake project, which has a very big rocket. There's a ratio between altitude and total impulse of 0.3. But a similar airframe that is a professional airplane, Arcus, essentially flies to 60-odd kilometers or more, with a ratio roughly about 1.5 between altitude and propellant. Boy, that seems awfully wasteful. It's hard to build a rocket when it's 8 inches in diameter and 12 feet long with a motor. This is not something that is easy. We want to do something a little different. The rocket we ended up with is the 2-stage rocket. In fact, this is the airframe that flew. It flew actually 4 times in flyable shape now. It is 2-stage 4 inches to 3 inches. It uses 2 Longbird motors, an N1 Aerotech N1000 to an Aerotech M685, alternatively a CTI M840. It's a total burn time of about 25 seconds between the 2 motors. It's all fiberglass construction because we wanted to be radio transparent. So we have radios. There's beacons on, as we'll find out, on both the booster and the sustainer, so we can keep real-time track of the airframe. And I think it has a commercial off-the-shelf on Karman nose cone. It has 2-phase recovery on both sustainer and booster. We like the recovery system. It's very compact. It only comes out of 1 airframe break, and we get to do 2-stage recovery on both. Have similar recovery systems out of both. It has active staging. There is at the end of booster burnout, there's a piston in the inner stage that pushes out the sustainer, and the sustainer then does its own ignition subsequently after a pre-programmed delay. We used a rail launch, in this case a 14-foot rail. One of the key pieces that I view is actually an inhibitor of why people have not done this before is that basically all the commercial hobby class rocketry simulation programs don't do drag right. And in fact, they massively overestimate drag, particularly supersonic drag. So that when we do the standard off-the-shelf simulation of this airframe using, say, RockSim or native RockSim Pro, it doesn't reach 100,000 feet. It reaches something like 90 or 85,000 feet. It does a little bit better if you use something like OpenRocket, which is a better drag estimator. But as we discovered, we'd actually began with one of our university teams to actually do a CFD model of the airframe to get a real drag. And that team pulled out. We actually had to do it ourselves. We found a desktop program called Visual CFD. And we did our own CFD on the airframe. And that one we calculated for the airframe, as you'll see, almost precisely matches the performance of the airframe. And is substantially less than any of the commercial products. So if you're thinking of planning something like this, all the commercial products essentially do drag wrong. And you can see the plots here. This is the bottom one is for the full stack, and the top is for the sustainer. And you can see even OpenRocket, which is the orange, is substantially greater. And if you look at RockSim, by the way, both RockSim and RockSim Pro use the same algorithm for calculating drag, so that you're going to find any supersonic rocket you model using those tools will have much higher drag than they actually will in purpose.
And if you enter in a more accurate coefficient, will those programs then work okay to simulate?
Yes, which is in fact what we did. So we use Visual CFD to actually compute these drag curves, and RockSim Pro will allow you to do that. Standard RockSim will not. It'll allow you to scale it, which doesn't really get you there. But you actually put in the real curve, it models almost exactly. So we've been able to, post-flight, recreate the flight pattern and model it, and it matches what we see here. We then use RockSim Pro with a 6DOF simulation to essentially model the performance. You can see that the full stack gets to be a little over Mach 1, and the sustainer alone gets to a little over Mach 3. It gets to Mach 3, though, at about 35,000 feet. So what you'll see, you can actually, if you look at the sustainer, you'll find that there's no trace of aerodynamic heating here at all. Aerodynamic heating happens right about here, when the supersonic shock wave that comes off the von Karman nose cone comes back to the body. And in fact, the major source of heating we discovered here was, in fact, our avionics bay was mounted to the top of the motor, and it's the motor heating is actually the major cause of heating. So this turns out to, as you'll see with Casey, it's pretty closely matched. One of our major concerns was, can we recover this thing within waver? We were operating with a 200,000 foot waver with a 10 nautical mile diameter. And a few years back, I had done this rather extensive research on the NOAA radiosonde data off of Black Rock to essentially model the high altitude winds. And so I have a pretty accurate wind model up to about 300,000, up to 100,000 feet, which is the radiosonde. And so we used that to plug into this to essentially model what we thought to be our dispersion analysis to give us some guarantee that, in fact, we would land within waver. As you can see, the dispersion analysis is 100 iteration on that. And so actually the booster lands somewhere over here, and the sustainer nominally lands over here, roughly about 3 miles from the launch point. One of the good things and bad things we'll talk about with dispersion analysis is you can only model what you think about ahead of time. And one of the pieces we did not anticipate was, as you'll see, losing the forward railguide on launch. And with the forward railguide, this dispersion analysis then becomes an interesting artifact, but not the reality of what was happening on the flight. One of the pieces that has been plaguing just about every high altitude amateur flight is the inability to get real data. People have gotten high, they think they've gotten high, they don't come back with data that says they've actually done it. So one of the things we wanted to make sure about was to fly with GPS, and not only fly with GPS, but to have real-time tracking flight. So we used ham-based 70 centimeter from Big Red B, B-line GPS tracking transmitters, one on the sustainer and one on the booster. But more importantly, we have over the last few years built our own ground station band called the Virtual Classroom, which was originally inspired by the guy who invented CANsats and CubeSats, Bob Twiggs. And before he left Stanford, he started this program to essentially allow us to build a essentially virtual reality of sharing what happens in the playa with the rest of the world. So we have an uplink satellite dish. We cover Wi-Fi out to an extraordinary dimension. We have real-time video cameras to essentially do real-time streaming video, as well as the downlink for these things with really good antennas. We're using some 70 centimeter circular polarized antennas that are really used for satellite downlinks. And they substantially increase the link budget and distance that you can actually receive. So we were able to essentially receive the telemetry from booster and sustainer in real time, plot it locally, and then actually share it in real time across the internet. And so if you're looking at one of the ham stations for aprs.net, you would discover and be able to monitor and see the flight in real time. So then our program plan was first to do two major test flights. One of the sustainer alone to essentially check out the avionics we were flying, the recovery method, to essentially validate that the basic system was operational. And then secondly, to fly the full stack with smaller motors, so it doesn't go quite as high, but a big enough motor that we actually simulate the staging event at the proper speed and the proper velocity. So it's staged Mach 1.1, slowed down. We did subsonic lighting of the sustainer. And as Casey will talk about the results of that. Then we had originally planned for 3 operational flights, one for each team, remember? So we actually had motors. So we instead flew those 3 flights with the two airframes that we had. This airframe here flew the sustainer test flight, the full stack test flight, and then the first 2 of the operational flights. So it's been 4 times transmach. And still flyable today, I would argue. So here's the team. I'd now like to turn it over to Casey to go through, as opposed to what we wanted to happen. What did happen? The voice of God.
Thanks, Ken. Give me just a second here and I'll get my stuff set up. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I'm Casey Barker. I'm a NAR in Tripoli Level 3, and I was the project manager, data wrangler, and all-around devil's advocate to Ken's grand vision, right? So when Sam first talked to me about doing the speech, I told him I could talk for an hour just about the avionics config, and if you let me, I will. So I'm sorry I have to read a speech, because if I ad-lib, I'll be off for 3 hours. Between the 2 test flights and 3 operational flights, we collected a mountain of data that I cannot hope to relay in 20 minutes. So today I'm just going to hit on a couple of stories from each flight, and the lessons from these stories are things that I hoped would be useful to you in your own projects. However, our full report is at aeropac.org. It's 100 pages. It's got text and photos and graphs and everything. So if you wake up tonight with a burning question, you know where to find the answer. And as Ken said, we started with 2 test flights leading up to the 3 full operational flights. So June 16th, 2012, Aeropac Mud Rock launch. We launched the sustainer by itself from a tower. And as with every flight, there was a ton of data validation and small tweaks and things that I'm just going to completely gloss over here and just hit on the high points. The big story of this flight was no Dyne avionics okay? Really get in there and mind meld with these things when you're making these flights, because over and over in this project, we would discover little nuggets of data, really important stuff hiding in the logs on these avionics. So going into this project, the big question for our team was barometer reliability. We know that a barometer will work great in the troposphere, but we weren't sure if it would detect apogee at 100K to deploy our drogue chute. So if you start from sea level and you go up 1,000 feet, pressure changes by 37 millibars. If you're up in the stratosphere and you go up 1,000 feet, pressure changes by 0.6 of a millibar. So of course you need a really good sensor to measure altitude that high. And these days, several altimeters are available that will measure it. But the question was, could they detect apogee? And so we were worried that just the natural pressure fluctuations of a rocket flight could cause a false apogee trigger on the barometer. So we, in our design stage, chose the Raven altimeter, this little guy right here. They're really fantastic. They're very small, very configurable. And they have an accelerometer. You can put them into an accelerometer mode to detect apogee with just the accelerometer. So we used the accelerometer on this flight to validate that it would work. Here is the report from the Raven. The blue is the barometric altitude, and the purple line is the accelerometer-derived velocity. Thank you. So right here is the accelerometer velocity. And you can see that accelerometer velocity hits 0 apogee before the barometer was going to reach apogee. So, and we trust the barometer here. This is only 12,700 feet. So we can see that we were cut short by an early deployment. So we spent hours looking at this graph. We sent it to the Raven developer, Adrian. We went back and forth and looked at other Raven flights. And ultimately, we determined the Raven's accelerometer is good for corroborating data, but that it's just not quite good enough to integrate, especially over a longer flight, to give you apogee. So if you're going to use a Raven, stick to the barometer, okay? But this, of course, threw a wrench in our whole plan. So August 4th at Aeronaut, we flew the stack test. We used an M1419 and the same K560 as on the sustainer test. If this flight has a story to tell, trust me, these guys know, it's that Delrin expands in the heat. But that's not interesting to most of you guys. If you want to know the whole story, it's in the report. That was a hard lesson to learn. Out in the field, yeah.
Actually, Delrin expands differently than fiberglass.
Yes, yeah, the thermal coefficient of expansion of Delrin is different from fiberglass. And aluminum. So as you can kind of see here, out in the field, we didn't really get the rail to point quite vertical. So that shows up in the data. And we have a new checklist item, bring a bubble level. So we use the same Ravens in both the booster and the sustainer. And for this flight, we sorry. Yes. Okay, I'm going to try and do better this time. You can tell it's kind of going out. Okay, so where were we? We set them to baro apogee because we wanted to get a clean apogee detect this time, and we would sort out the details later. Meanwhile, we also flew an RDAS altimeter up in the nose cone where the science payload would normally go. Now, the RDAS, it's a bit bigger, it's bulkier. It's an older design, and it's also quite expensive, but it does have a very high precision accelerometer. So here's the flight. The yellow is the booster, the green's the sustainer, and the sustainer hit 34,400 feet. That's a third of the way to our goal, not bad. And we got it less than a mile away from the launch site. Fantastic, even with that little bit of a lean from the pad. Of course, the Raven barometer worked perfectly. RDAS also pegged apogee right on time. So we knew we had a solution to go to 100K. But we couldn't fit two of the RDASs in that little sustainer together in the same bay. So we went back and we modified the bay. So we flew one RDAS and one Raven. So we've now got a heterogeneous design in the sustainer. So we learned a lot, we tweaked a lot from that flight, but at the end of the day, it was all it could teach us. We had to go the next step to learn anything more. And at this point, we were feeling, pretty good about our design. What could go wrong, right? So if you'll indulge me, I want to take a little detour here, and I think I've got enough time. So I want to talk about the design of our recovery system because I'm really fascinated by this stuff. I love this part. The sustainer had a dual deploy system, just like the booster, with the RDAS serving as primary and the Raven serving as a backup. But we were still scared about the barometer at 100K. So we decided we would just set a timer on the Raven as backup for 110 seconds. 1 week out before the launch, I'm sitting on my kitchen table trying to program the altimeters. I discover the longest timer you can set on a Raven is 51 seconds. Uh-oh. So this sent us into a very dark place. We started asking really fundamental questions. What was the purpose of a backup unit, right? If we switched it over to Barrow, would it hurt our flight more than it helped it, right? Why do we even have this thing here? Should we just turn it off, right? That was Ken's call. Just turn the thing off. So there's this technique in product engineering you might have heard of called DFMEA, Design Failure Mode Effects Analysis. I didn't think much of it. It's a buzzword, right? But it's fancy engineer speak for list everything you know or you think might go wrong and how bad it would be. And it turns out this is really useful because it gives you a structured framework to think about all these different failure modes and reason about the system as a whole when you can't fit it all in your head, right? So once you think you have a solution, you walk down the list and make sure you've got all your bases covered. So we decided we wanted to tolerate a failure of any single recovery subsystem. If we had 2 failures, but any single thing should be able to just completely go away and we should be okay. So the key insight from doing this analysis was that there are really 2 scenarios where we need the Raven as a backup. And they're very, very different scenarios. Scenario 1 is that the RDAS fails. Why isn't that red? Oh, well. Scenario 1 is right here. The RDAS fails before it lights the sustainer, and apogee happens somewhere below 30,000 feet. In that case, we really needed the Raven. We needed its barometer, and we needed it to fire on time. The second situation, scenario 2, these down here, we knew that we were going to have apogee in the stratosphere, right? So we didn't trust the Raven barometer there, but in a way, that scenario is much more forgiving because the air is thin. So we reasoned that it was okay if the drogue came out a little late, or even really late. We just didn't want it to come out early and cut our flight short. Ironically, the solution comes back to timers on the Raven, and I really like this part. So to cover scenario 1, the Raven can fire the CD3, but only if barometric apogee happens in the first 51 seconds of flight. So that matches scenario 1. Beyond 51 seconds, the Raven never fires the CD3. Then, to cover scenario 2, we let the Raven fire the apogee, backup apogee BP charge 30 seconds after barometric apogee, whenever that might happen. Now that 30 seconds was a total swag, right? We had no idea what that number should be, but we guessed based on where we thought it might faults detect and sort of the latest time we could get the drogue out and still be safe before we got back down to thicker air where we would start to pay a penalty for hitting the air too hard. So this combination of programming is completely unconventional. I don't think anybody else has ever done anything like that. But it neatly covered all of those failure modes that we were concerned about. So out of our last-minute panic video conference came this really cool solution that actually covers all of our bases better than the timer would. Okay, so that's my indulgence. For the full operational flights, which is what you all came to see, we brought 2 full airframes and 3 sets of motors to Express. And on September 11, 2012, we made our first full operational flight on an N1000 and an M685, the new one. And the story of this flight was success, with a caveat. And it was a relatively small decision made very early in the design process that contributed to that. But I'd like to start with the success. So the sustainer separated at 14,000 feet, around 1,000 feet per second, accelerated to Mach 3, hit apogee at 104,659 feet, 93 seconds after liftoff. I have that number memorized. And this is what it looks like. We have video and stuff we'll show you as well. So we had tracking on the entire flight. We knew exactly when it had crossed the mark. We knew that the sustainer and the booster's parachutes had come out, they'd deployed. We knew exactly where they were. And part of the success story is also the subsystem failures that we survived. Because so this blue line is the Raven's barometric apogee again. And it's zoomed in to cover about a minute around apogee. And after all that grief, the RDAS actually fired a few seconds after apogee. It was good, but the CD3 failed. So right here at 105 seconds, nothing happened. and in fact, in the video, you can hear it go, nothing happens. And in fact, if you look up here at the top, this top line is the Raven's pressure increasing signal. And you notice there's a glitch here. Right around here, there's a little bit of glitch in the barometer. And sure enough, 13 seconds before apogee, the Raven called apogee. But we covered that. So 30 seconds later, at 110 seconds, the nose cone comes off because of the backup BP charge. So our programming for all of those scenarios worked, and I just could not be more happy about how that panned out. And in the end, we ejected the drogue on time, we ejected the main on time, we had a very safe, soft landing.
So you had a black powder charge go off at 105,000 feet?
We did, and we can talk about that. I just don't have it in my speech. There's a lot of data in the document on that.
And in fact, going forward, we're planning on actually eliminating the CD3 and just going solely to it's surgically, it's black powder to surgical. So it's under black. Yes,
Exactly, yeah.
Sealed.
So we had this nice, safe, soft landing, but we need to talk about the landing. Yeah. Okay, so this plot is yellow is the sustainer, red is the booster, blue is the wind and the relative strength in the vector, right? So almost immediately after liftoff, we knew something had broken because of the trajectory it took. So when the sustainer lit around here, it was 25 degrees off of vertical. At apogee, the airframe was moving 1,100 feet per second. By the time the drogue came out, it had fallen some, and it was moving at 1,200 feet per second. So all of that talk about thin air being forgiving, we were right? If it had been at 30,000 feet, we'd have been toast. So we recovered the booster nearby, and as soon as we did, we knew the problem. You can see it right there. The forward surface mount rail guide was gone. And the next morning, Charlie Whitman found it out by the pad. So we think what actually happened was this was a two-section rail guide, and we think it actually got caught at the separation between the two sections. Meaning we had maybe 3 feet of guidance on our 14-foot rail. Not good enough, not what Ken simulated. Fortunately, about 11 minutes later, the sustainer landed in open hills near a trail that we were able to get to. We had tracking, we knew right where it was, and we recovered it the same day. So John Carmack awarded us the prize pending our final report, which was a major part of it, right? And we worked really hard on that too. The sustainer was in a safe configuration for the entire flight. It was on drogue and on main. It didn't really present any danger to anybody on the ground, but nonetheless, we were obviously very humbled by this landing, and it was not what we were after. So after a real quick celebration, we stepped right back to work. And the very first order of business was to get some channel locks and rip off the remaining rail guides. we replaced them with buttons screwed into aluminum. We were not going to have another failure like that. We probably could have left the buttons actually on there, but
No, they screw into the EF thing.
no, the remaining rail guides could have stayed, but it just felt good to rip them off.
That frustration.
Mm-hmm. So, 2 days later, September 13th, we made our second operational flight with an N1000 and an M840. And the story of this flight is human factors, also known as go fever. Gosh, that's a beautiful picture, isn't it? I just love that picture. So to make this flight, we had to recycle airframe A in a day, basically. And an assembled airframe is a really tricky master, right? It represents a whole day of work to get the thing packed and ready to go. But ours had a limited shelf life. We had GoPro cameras on board with a wireless backpack that would drain the battery in about 6 hours. So this was the way we controlled the cameras, was these little remotes. But once we packed the airframe, we had about 6 hours to fly. So naturally, once you've got it packed, you really don't want to take it back down, because then you have to take it all apart and recharge everything. You really want to fly. And that's a problem, right? So we got it on the pad. We found a broken connection. Had to take it back off the pad, rebuild half of it. And we were in a rush before the sun set, as you can see here. The packing of the sustainer was a little bit rushed. We didn't get the recovery maybe quite as neat and tidy as it should have been. And because this was our second trip out to the pad that day, the checklist wasn't, quite the same, and I forgot an item. I forgot to turn on those GoPros. So we have these fantastic launch images, but no video. And because we don't have video, we don't really completely understand what happened next. But fortunately, Pat Wagner caught a series of really good telephoto images. Yeah, that's at 20-some thousand feet. We speculate that the sustainer nose cone drag separated, burst its shear pins and drag separated, and just after the staging happened. So here's the trajectory. The booster coasted clean to about 22,000, and about 1,000 feet higher than the sustainer, which was kind of weird. The good news on this flight was that we were measurably improved in verticality. So we recovered everything actually very close in, less than a mile. And in fact, when we back into this trajectory with a simulation, we're convinced that it would have landed in range. So we feel like we had that problem solved. We just ran into another problem. And in any event, we got everything back on parachutes. That was that airframe's fourth flight, and it was the winning airframe. So we retired it. We don't want to fly that airframe anymore because we like it. September 16. Yeah, this is Sunday, the very last day of Express. We made our third flight on an N1000 and an M650 5-grain this time. And I had to dig really deep for a story for this flight, and the same quote kept popping into my head. The best laid schemes of mice and men oft go awry. This was an intense flight. It was the first flight ever of that B airframe, the second airframe that we constructed. And it was the first one with a really true functional science payload. So we took all the earlier lessons in. We put on the rail buttons, we ripped off the rail guides. We nixed the GoPro wireless entirely. We drilled a couple holes in the airframe, used a screwdriver to press the on button. Done, right? And that just relaxed a whole set of conditions on this airframe. So when the winds got too high on Saturday, we scrubbed the Sunday. No big deal. Airframe was ready. We didn't have to take it apart. Everything was fine. We got it out to the pad. One of the booster grains was misaligned. We took it back down, reassembled the booster, brought it back out. It was okay because we had shelf life now. So we didn't have to rush. We didn't have any of those kind of troubles. And in spite of higher ground wind, the boost trajectory was essentially the same as Flight 2. Pretty good, but the sustainer didn't light. The sustainer's in yellow there. We think what happened was the piston that ejects the sustainer clipped the igniter wire when it ejected the sustainer. We think that's what happened. I'm not 100% certain.
There's a nice clean cut on the
Yeah, it was a good clean cut, so we feel like that piston just caught the wire. There was a little extra wire in there that time. So at this point, we discovered a new line item for our failure analysis. Apogee for the booster and the sustainer was up at 20-some thousand feet, 25.9 for the sustainer, right in the middle of the jet stream, which, as you can kind of see here, was moving a lot faster. And what happened was the airframes were moving maybe 50 feet per second into the wind, relative to ground. So not too bad. But as soon as they popped the drogue, they were moving 160 feet the other direction, 160 feet per second. So it was a dramatic yank on the airframe. Both airframes have Kevlar shock cords, and both airframes zippered. Good 6 inches on both of them. In fact, you can almost see the violence, right, in this plot here. You can see the sudden change of direction up there, and right there for a second or two, 160 feet per second the other way. So really, really violent. But we got everything back more or less intact except for the zippers, and we retired airframe B after its very first flight. So I want to come back to the positive again for a minute. We won the Carmack Prize. The winning flight had a caveat. It was something we feel like we rectified in the following 2 flights. But that challenge of a perfect flight, of course, is still out there for us. And I couldn't be more proud of the team and everything we accomplished here. Last year's caveat is this year's opportunity. So inspired by our flight, Carmack is proposing a new prize for 100,000 foot with a spot landing within a mile. So actually repeatable. In fact, make 2 flights, land them both within a mile of each other. So that sounds really nice and hard. So we're going to try and dramatically improve our targeting and make these 100K flights as reliable as ARLIS, and we think that's a suitably aggressive challenge for our team. But we share all this challenge with all of you guys as well. As a community, we feel like we've turned a bit of a corner here. We now have a blueprint using hobbyist fiberglass, hobbyist avionics, and a couple of motors that any level 3 can buy off the shelf, and you can get to 100,000 feet. And we think that's a really cool thing, and we'll see you guys at Black Rock. So this is the end of my report, but you might have noticed the paint job on airframe B. Our science payload for Flight 3 was a Google Nexus phone. And Google took an interest in our project early on, and from the very beginning. And it turns out that a Galaxy Nexus phone fits perfectly up there in the nose cone. So Google brought out a film crew and some really cool camera technology to film our launch. And they produced a couple of videos. There's a 2-minute Nexus advertisement and a 6-minute vignette about our project. They took a little bit of poetic license with a storyline, you know. But they painted this really positive picture of our hobby. And I really couldn't be more happy about that because, you know, we've had some public exposure that hasn't always been completely positive or focused on the danger. And they painted this really, really positive picture. So this is really good. They're launching the marketing campaign next month. The videos are not yet public, but Google loves you guys. And so I got permission to give you a quick sneak preview of these marketing videos. The only thing I ask is that you not record them because we don't want to sort of spoil their surprise. Thank you, Jeff. So please sit back and enjoy, and then if you stick around, we'll do Q&A after this if we still have time, and I don't think we have much. So here you go.
Today we're building a 2-stage rocket designed to reach 100,000 feet. John Carmack is sponsoring a competition for amateur rocketry enthusiasts to break 100,000 feet. We started to see that we could fit a Nexus phone in the nose cone of this 100,000 foot design, that we could conceivably relay data to a Nexus ground station. We'd like to get all the data off these flights and see really what exactly happened and understand how we can make them better. it's amazing that I can build something in my basement that gets to the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. It's the nearest thing to being an astronaut.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
2,000 feet. 10,000 feet. Sustainer ignition. 20,000 feet. 90,000 feet. 102,000 feet. Apogee at 104,659 feet at T plus 93 seconds.
Camera is amazing. Any questions?
You mentioned the Arcus had a 1.5 ratio of what, altitude to impulse? What's yours?
1.5. The same as yours.
And they don't recover it.
So the off-the-shelf altimeters aren't quite sufficient. Any thoughts about doing a run of special design, working with?
We're building
current
one.
vendors?
We're talking to folks, and
Everything else is off the shelf, right?
well, one of the cool pieces, I think pretty much off the shelf, like, you can actually buy off the shelf altimeters and fly it. So we flew it with an RDAS. And RDAS is actually space capable. It's been flown in a number of high altitude flights above 100 kilometers. So it's actually a space capable platform in its own right. But both the RDAS and the Raven have their challenges, and we'd like to see better systems. The other piece I think we've learned a lot about is about GPS. So a lot of people have challenges with GPS, but it's all using the right GPS. And so we used GPSs here that use the U-Blocks chipset, and it's important if you use the U-Blocks chipset, and if you program it right, configure it right, it does really, really, really good. And you can buy those off the shelf. So hopefully we'll inspire folks like our colleagues here to make better ones, so we can do a better job.
I got a photo board you can go look at.
I intend to.
Yeah, we're really excited about what Keith is building over there.
But also we're seeing there's an RDS 5 out, there's a whole set of new technology coming out that we're going to be able to see and have the opportunity to use.
If I could make an opinion, I think sensor fusion is probably the way to go, because alone a barrow is not maybe good enough for that altitude, but as you can see, you need it in some cases, right? So GPS, accelerometers, gyros, barrow, everything integrated into a single model, with a great big common filter. Right? I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, we're really going to have it. Actually, one of the cool things that I have going in the project also is that we did telemetry here, of really narrowband telemetry. But as we saw if you were at the ARLIS presentation a while back, the new mini ARLIS that Lynn Kaminsky is building actually has a Wi-Fi chip on board. And it turns out that I'm building a Wi-Fi payload, and I believe the link budget will allow us to do streaming Wi-Fi video at 120,000 feet.
I have data that shows that's possible.
Pardon me?
I've done Wi-Fi at about 30,000 feet.
And I believe, so we're now moving to a world in which we're going to be able to explore this space with roughly off-the-shelf stuff that does amazing stuff, seeing it visually, instrumentally, in a way that we've never been able to do before.
So did you get data back from the Nexus phone?
Yes, actually. And it's a great big data file, and actually on that flight, it ends right, remember that 160 foot per second jerk? And that kind of did it. And something which I think we had a yo-yo board plugged into the USB port, and it glitched right there and stopped recording. But all the data up to that point confirmed what the other avionics told us, you know, it all was pretty well in line.
How is that Nexus communicating with the ground station?
So there was a ham radio, 2 meters, and we actually wrote some software on the Nexus phone to speak AFSK over that ham radio and then decoded it on the ground.
Okay.
In fact, so I've got this 6-minute vignette that I know we're intruding into lunchtime here, but if anybody wants to stick around and watch the vignette, we can show you that as well.
We'll stop talking. Yeah.
So this one's not quite done yet, but it's pretty close to done.
I think it's enormously liberating to be able to give individuals the power to investigate their world.
Technology always starts as something esoteric and expensive, and then it filters down to the masses. And once the masses get a hold of it, we do fun things with it. Today we're building a 2-stage rocket designed to reach 100,000 feet. John Carmack is sponsoring a competition for amateur rocketry enthusiasts to break 100,000 feet and publish the design for the rocket to help advance the state of the art.
We built a 2-stage rocket. So you start with one stage that burns for a while. You discard all the extra weight, leaving another rocket that fires again, and it flies the rest of the 80% of the flight.
The 2-stage was the only way we could reach the altitude we wanted, but it's very difficult to get a successful 2-stage flight. The Black Rock Desert is the best place in the world for this kind of rocketry. We've got the biggest piece of nowhere anywhere on Earth.
It's a very challenging environment to launch in.
There's wind, there's dust, it's hot. It makes life difficult every way it can. Everyone here is either an engineer or a hobbyist who loves getting their hands dirty. For us, it's all a big playground.
Previously, getting into space has been governments. Now we're moving to the place where individuals can find a way to get close to space, right? We're doing it ourselves, as opposed to depending on other people. So I think this is a trend of do it yourself.
We've got our droid astronaut. He's getting ready for his phone and the nose cone of this 100,000 foot design. The phone's got a gyroscope, it's got an accelerometer, it's got a barometer, it's got a GPS, it's got all these sensors that make it sort of like a little miniature satellite. We could conceivably relay that data to a Nexus ground station, and that tells us an awful lot about what the rocket is doing in front of us.
There's only been a handful of amateurs that have gone over 100,000 feet. The highest piece that men have gone to is Everest, which is 29,000 feet. Passenger jet flies roughly about the height of Everest, about 35,000 feet. U-2 spy planes went to 70, 80,000 feet. In order to get to 100,000 feet, we will have to fly roughly at 3 times the speed of sound, which is Mach 3, roughly about 2,000 miles an hour. That is 50% faster than the fastest military jet aircraft flown by the U.S. today.
From 100,000 feet, you can start to see the curvature of the Earth. You can see the black of space. It's amazing that I can build something in my basement that gets to the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. It's the nearest thing to being an astronaut. We're flying tomorrow morning. Success is guaranteed.
Nothing more ecstatic and more frightening, actually, is when the thing you built is sitting along the ground.
butterflies galore in the last few seconds just before you push the button, because at that point you don't have any control of it. It's off on its own.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Oh.
10,000 feet. Sustainer ignition. 20,000 feet. 90,000 feet. 102,000 feet. Apogee is 104,659 feet at T plus 93 seconds.
Turns out the rocket was in a hugely rugged country. We would never have found it if I didn't know it was there. And I could look at Google Maps and say that there were actually roads to get there. Here's our guy. Nothing broken. He's all good. No, 300,000 feet is the demarcation of space. That's really space. And we're not sure if we can get there or not, but we think we can get awfully close. The thrill of this thing compels me to try and go a little better, a little faster, a little higher.